So, hey, welcome everybody. Welcome to the David Henning Mindset Podcast. And what we try to do is bring you a lot of value. We talk about things like faith, family, finance, give you some tips to improve in those areas. And today I have a special guest that we're going to be able to get to an in-depth conversation here for a minute because I've been doing financial services since 2007. And one of the most difficult things in my industry, when you do life insurance investments and you build a bond with families and you help them and they become lifelong clients, is when that client passes away and you have to go help that family with all of the benefits and everything you've done and the transition and helping them, file all the necessary paperwork, the estate planning and everything else. And you don't ever really know what to say to a grieving family when they lose a loved one. And it's super important to make sure you say and do the right things. You can never make those situations truly comfortable, right? You want to do the best you can, but it's a difficult situation. So my guest, Kelly, here today has an interesting foundation, right? You have a counseling service for that, right?
Yeah.
For people that are grieving.
Yeah.
So introduce yourself real quick. Give everybody your full name, the name of your company.
Yeah.
And kind of explain, to everyone exactly what it is you guys do.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Kelly Nielsen, and our company name is Grace for Living After Loss, because that's what people need. They need grace. They need tools. They need help. They need some supernatural help to learn how to live after you experience loss. It is a traumatic thing, no matter when you face it or how you face it. Most people are not prepared for it, and so there's a state of shock that initially sets in. And I think that's first of all, if folks have life insurance policies, I'm so thrilled. If your reps are going out to meet with them, it means they were somewhat prepared, and so they're gonna have some help with the financial hardships. I deal with a lot of families that don't have life insurance, and they have financial pressures and stress on top of the trauma and stress of losing someone that you love. But if you're coming across somebody who's experienced loss, one thing you want to remember is that they're probably in some sort of state of shock, especially if it's right after the event. There's a condition known as grief brain, where you have a hard time retaining information. You have a hard time putting together your words. You're very disorganized because neurologically speaking, your brain goes from confused to angry to sad. And so it's really a tough time to make decisions or even receive information. So what I recommend if you're talking to somebody who's experienced loss, first of all, keep it simple. Keep it so simple. And anything that you can give them in written form, some written information that they can look at later, or they can actually give to a trusted friend or advisor during that time. That's one of the things I recommend for people when they reach out to us. And if it's in the very early stages, I ask them to find an advocate or a grief buddy, somebody who's a little bit removed from the situation that can help them, organize paperwork, make decisions, make arrangements, because it's sort of crazy to me that, in the midst of your crisis, you have to make all these really big decisions and plan a funeral and do all sorts of things that you're actually intellectually and neurologically not in a good position to do that. So anything that you can do to provide advocacy, to give simple, concrete steps. Another thing is, just for general listeners, if you have someone who's experienced loss, don't say, well, let me know if there's anything you need. So many people say that, let me know how I can help, or let me know if there's anything you need. People who are grieving don't know what they need. And even if they knew what they needed, they'd have a tough time formulating the thoughts and asking for the help. So a much better response is to just offer the help and let them say yes or no. So say, I'm going to bring over a meal next Wednesday. Do you prefer chicken or beef? Make it, again, as simple decisions as you can so that they can easily accept or refuse that instead of putting the burden and the weight on them to figure it out. So
that's awesome. I love that because I never know what to say.
Right.
So I am very generic and I'm like, hey, whatever you need, call me. I'm here for you, right?
Right.
So that's a great point because I would have never thought of that, just to be real specific in how I'm going to help them so to take that burden off of them. So
yeah,
that's a great point. So, and then you have some other advice also?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, anything that you can do for them and take off their plate, just do it. If you can, a lot of people bring meals, that's great, provide groceries. Another thing I would say is give them a gift card to go out and have dinner. As the weeks go on and they're kind of sitting with the grief, it gets harder and heavier to want to go out of the house and that's so important in terms of their recovery. So that would be another suggestion I have is, I had two kind of traumatic losses, and in both cases, it was 3 weeks after the loss that everyone else goes back to their life, and you're left there trying to figure out how to do life. So I want to encourage you, if you know someone who's experienced loss, reach out right away, but then put a reminder in your phone for 3 weeks or a month or 3 months after the loss, because that's actually really when they need your help. That's when the adrenaline has wore off. That's when everybody else has gone back to their lives and they're left trying to figure out what to do or how to move forward. So reach out afterwards, still make it simple, make it yes, no things that they can easily, cooperate or participate in.
Let me ask you about something, because I have a situation right now where a friend of mine lost a family member.
Yeah.
And I was trying to ask her, how she was feeling, how she was doing.
Yeah.
And she goes, I don't know.
Yeah.
She couldn't process everything.
Right.
She's been so busy dealing with everything right now. She hasn't had time for the emotions to hit.
Yep.
So how long is it usually before everything like really sinks in? Because I've seen people where they seem okay, but they're not really.
Yeah, most people go into kind of like an autopilot thing when it happens. You're in this state of shock and there's adrenaline and there's so much that needs to be done that you just kind of go into motion. And so usually between the 1 to 3 month mark after the loss, and really sometimes it takes people as long as 6 months after the loss for it to truly set in that, oh my gosh, this is real and this person isn't coming back. And so anytime in that first 1 to 6 month mark is usually when it really sets in for them.
So is it good or bad for somebody to stay so busy or distract themselves from dealing with the situation?
I think it's bad. I think that, again, in that very initial, there are things you just have to do. But the danger with staying so busy is that people can do that for years. And if grief is something that doesn't go away. If you don't deal with it, it's going to stay underneath the surface and it's going to manifest in other unhealthy ways, most likely. And so if that's your strategy for dealing with it, that'll work for a while, but it's never going to go away and you've never dealt and processed it. We're actually not meant to grieve long term. Like the biblical term for grief is described as like an affliction or a sickness. We're called to mourn. Okay. That's what God calls us to, is the process of mourning, where we're processing the loss, and when you mourn, it resolves the grief. But if you never mourn properly, if you just run around and stay busy, you're going to have that grief living underneath the surface. And again, it's going to, I spoke to a woman just not that long ago. It had been 10 years since she lost her sister, and she couldn't bring her up without crying. We were at a networking event, and she so clearly had not processed the loss or dealt with it. She just probably had kept herself busy, and it was right there, right under the surface. And so that's what we help people do. We help teach them how to mourn, how to process the loss, how to come to reconciliation, some sort of level of peace with the fact that they've lost their loved one physically anyways. And then we help them design and define what they want their life to look like going forward. And it can be really beautiful, actually. Just because we've lost someone doesn't mean they stop being a part of our life. And we actually get to decide and design how we want to incorporate them in our lives going forward. How do we want to remember them? How do we want to celebrate and honor them? What do we want to do for their legacy and in their honor? And when you can shift to that perspective and start making choices and start doing things to keep you connected to your loved one in a healthy way and honoring way, that's when life gets enjoyable again. That's when you can be connected and it doesn't have to be sorrowful or sad or heavy or hard. It can actually be really beautiful and uplifting, and that's the transition we help people to make.
And that's awesome. I mean, we had a conversation the other day, and you were saying that there's a difference between like what you guys do, because I don't know if there are any other services like what you do. Right? There's obviously Christian groups that allow you to talk about the process, right? But they don't tell you how to deal with it. So sometimes talking about things, it helps a little bit, but it doesn't really get you through the entire process. So what's the major difference between what you guys do and some of these other services that may just allow you to get together with other people that are grieving and talk about it?
Yeah, I love that question. And community is an important part of your recovery, but it's just a part of your recovery. What I really learned about in my recovery was the neuroscience behind it all and how our minds work and what happens to our brains and bodies when we experience trauma. And the tough thing about a lot of support groups is people share their loss and they're just rehearsing their pain, which neurologically speaking, you're re-traumatizing yourself over and over again. So people can go to support groups and 2 years later they're in the same place because they've just kept repeating their stuff. So what we provide is concrete steps, like practical, applicable things that you can do, subtle things that you can change and do every day that is going to rewire your brain on how you view the loss and how you're moving forward. And you're literally instructing your brain on how you want life to look going forward, and you meditate on that and you rehearse that and you match it with action, right? You put small little actions every day to tell yourself, your mind and your body, that you are recovering from this. You will get through this. You are learning to be happy again. You send that message to yourself, and then you follow it up with action, and that is the difference. That's the difference between staying stuck and truly recovering from grief and loss, and that's what we help people to do.
So you've experienced grief yourself, right? So what is the hardest part in overcoming that grief?
Well, there's really two things in my opinion. One is there's a lot of misconceptions and just bad information out there. When people talk about grief and loss, there's sort of two schools of thought. Number one is you'll never recover. I actually get in arguments with people, grieving people, because they're like, I lost my child. How dare you say I'm never going to get over this? And that's widespread. Like, a lot of people believe that. And if you believe that, you will never recover. So that's the first thing, is just finding the right information and belief that you can recover. That's the biggest stumbling block for most people. And then the second hardest part for me personally is it's very isolating. Even if you find the strength and information to want to recover, losing someone very close to you, a lot of people are uncomfortable by death and loss. A lot of people don't understand it. And then your story is painful for other people. So friendships change, relationships change. A lot of people keep you at arm's length because your story makes them uncomfortable. And that's a hard thing to navigate, to like come to peace with that my story is my story, and some people it makes them uncomfortable, and that's just the journey that I'm on. It's a piece of the puzzle, but it's definitely been a hard one to figure out.
So with that, you said something that was really important, like, your story, like, what you're dealing with. And I see so many people that grief or that difficult situation becomes their identity.
Yep.
Not their story, but their identity.
Yep.
So you talk about people putting you at arm's length. It's because every time they see you, they hear the same story, and that's all you talk about, right? So do you find that happens with a lot of people, that becomes their identity more than just their story?
Yeah, and actually just recently I went through a name change even with my own company. So I used to be called the Grief Guru. That was the name that I had. And just like, honestly, in the last 6 months, God talked to me about, like, you were never meant to be the grief guru. We're not meant to master grief. It was not something we were ever meant to abide in or to learn, right? And he said, you're meant to master joy. You have to teach people how to live life, not just deal with grief. And so that's why we made the switch from the grief guru to grace for living after loss, because there's life to be lived. There's things to be identified. But I see so many parents, especially, more than any other type, a parent that loses a child, it's very easy for them to put that on as their identity, because culture lines up to agree with that. Everywhere they go, they're like, oh, that's the person that lost their child, and people relate to them that way and call them that way. And so you have to be very intentional and go against the grain to not slip into that. If I had a nickel for every person who came after I lost my son, they came up to me and said, oh my gosh, Kelly, I don't know how you get out of bed in the morning. So many people would say that to me. And if I wasn't careful, I would have been like, yeah, you're right. I'm just going to go back to bed and lay down. And I would have had a slew of people agreeing and saying that that's totally appropriate. But I want so much more for my life than just laying in bed and being miserable and sad. And so that's why it takes a certain kind of person. You have to have a certain kind of fire in your belly, and you have to want to get better and want to live the life that God has for you more than what the people or society around you would say. Because especially in today's culture, people are so quick to put on their victim label. And a parent that loses a child, that's a pretty big victim label, and a lot of people can agree with and say, oh yeah, you're just going to be sad for the rest of your life and you're never going to recover, and we don't expect much from you anymore because you lost a child. But I'm here to say that there's more to that's available. Full, complete recovery is available, and just because you lose someone, you still have a life to live, and you can live a life that you love living, that honors and celebrates your loved one and incorporates your loved one in the days that you have left. And so that's what I'm here to show people how to do.
I love that, because one of the things I specialize in is something called the $1 Million Baby. Okay, so the $1 Million Baby is a life insurance policy you do on your child. And parents all the time say, I don't want to think about putting life insurance on my child. I don't want to think about my child dying. And I said, really, this policy is designed for your child to live, and you're setting them up for their future. But on the other side, I want you to think about something. Heaven forbid we lose a child, and it does happen, right? Do you want to have to turn around and go right back to work immediately,
Right.
and you never get to deal with these feelings, you don't get to grieve properly, you don't get to process it, right? The policy just allows you to be financially okay if that happens.
I love that you're bringing that up, and I just want to say to parents, like, well, I don't want to think about my child dying. That, shame on you. That's irresponsible. That's like saying you don't get medical insurance because you don't want to think about your child getting sick. Like, life happens, and our job as parents are to protect our children. And especially if you have other children, I want to implore you to get life insurance on all your children, because when you lose one, you need resources and time. I didn't have life insurance on my son, and it was by the grace of God that people gave donations, and it almost matched, like, to the dollar what his funeral cost. So thank God, like, I didn't have to have a financial burden for the funeral. That was covered. But yeah, I went back to work like a week later, and I was not ready to go back to work, but I had to go back to work. And so that is the best gift you can give, your spouse, yourself, your other children, your family. Should that happen in your family, you're all gonna need time to heal, recover, and adjust, and the freedom to make the decisions that are right for you. I meet so many people that it takes them a long time to go back to their job, or they're even unable to do the job they were doing, and they need to make a shift. Sometimes it's a lateral shift, sometimes it's not. So having some, finances to help empower those decisions, it's changed the way that I view it, for sure.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what happens to somebody when they aren't able to process it? So you do have to go back to work immediately, and you have to just push through everything like everything's normal when it's not. What's the devastation that occurs?
Oh my gosh, it's all the ills of our society. When you look around, depression, anxiety, suicide, addiction, most of them stem from unresolved grief. People are walking around with grief and trauma that they haven't dealt with, and it breeds all of those things, and especially in family. And let's talk for 1 second about suicides. When a suicide happens in a family, all the other family members are now 4 times as likely to commit suicide, because this thing that was far-reaching and untouchable happened to you. And so now it becomes a viable solution in your mind. Like, oh, well, so-and-so committed suicide, so they're not in pain anymore. Now I have this unbearable pain of a loved one who committed suicide, and it becomes viable. So it's so critical that we reach families and people at the time of trauma and get them help, and really help them to focus on the recovery work, because if not, it's going to show up 6 months, 2 years, 3 years later as one of these other things that we just spoke about.
And so I think, I talk about this on the podcast a lot, about processing things and thinking through it. Because in our society today, especially when you have like alpha males, right? Men and women think very differently about things, right? And as like an alpha male, we're taught we have to be tough, we can't show emotion, we have to just work our way through things, right? And that's not always healthy. And it leads to other problems with us. And so when you work with men and women, do you approach it differently?
Oh, absolutely. Men are totally different when it comes to grief. They're very compartmentalized, and they're fixers. And this isn't something that can be fixed. So they just want to get on with life. And that's why I think a lot of marriages fail after they lose a child, because as women, we're feelers and we're processors. We need to talk about it. We need to express it. And a lot of times husbands unknowingly abandon their wives in that moment, because they either don't have the equipment or the ability to relate and hear their wives and be with their wives in that moment. And so they absolutely process it differently, and giving both of them an understanding of how the other one is processing it, and being careful not to judge, because wives tend to think, oh my gosh, my husband's so heartless, he doesn't even care, he's right. Back at work, and he's, and husbands think, why are we talking about it? It's not going to change, and so bridging that gap is really important. We tend to work with more women. It's usually women that seek us out for the help, because they need more room to process and talk about it. But we've done some work with married couples, and it's really beautiful when you can find a neutral space to process it together and really learn from one another, and meet each other in that place.
I think that's huge because you almost described me to a T, right? And we, most men, we don't always understand what our wife needs. And if we don't understand it, like we don't understand the need for communication sometimes because we just work through problems and we're like, okay, it'll work itself out. We're just going to keep going and make it happen. And I've learned that with finances, that it's very important to have that communication. So especially in this process, it's even more important to have that communication. So the fact that you sit down with married couples is awesome. And I would suggest that any man, whether you feel the need or not, be supportive of your spouse and sit down because you may find some value.
You know what? And just be present. I think it's so hard for men because you don't like to see your wife hurting and you want to fix it, right? And there's no fix to this. If you lost a child or a loved one, you just have to sit with it and let them work through it. And I think that's why it makes men uncomfortable because you can't fix it for her. You can't fix her. Her heart is broken, it's shattered in a million pieces, and you can't fix it. But what means the world for her is for you to be present with her and to not leave her alone in that place. She just really needs somebody to be with her and listen, or not listen, just be quiet and be with her.
That's some really good stuff because you just helped me gain some clarity on some things.
Yeah.
So that was powerful. So if people need to get a hold of you, people are going through grief, what's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so our website and YouTube channel and Facebook group is all Grace for Living After Loss. You can find us in all of those places. And we have just a ton of free resources. And then we have a team of coaches that work with people one-on-one through this process. We've specifically recruited different types of coaches with different types of losses because my heart and vision is to match somebody with as close of a loss experience that they had. So you're really learning from someone who's been in your shoes or as close to it. Because I think there's a tremendous amount, and none of us are licensed counselors. I'm not a counselor. I don't have a degree. I'm a person who has hand-to-hand combat, personal experience with this, and all of our coaches do as well. And we're not there to help, placate or just keep you stuck in a place. We're going to give you a solid path process to lead you through to a place of recovery and getting back to living a life that you love.
So that's awesome. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop all the links, all the contacts for you right on the podcast. So if anybody wants to get a hold of you, they can reach you.
Absolutely.
What I would love to do, if you're open to it, is have you come back again.
Sure.
And if you're willing to share like your personal testimony of like everything that you went through.
Sure.
I think that's powerful because testimony is a great thing.
Yeah.
We always go through the test, but the test is created to create that testimony to help others.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would love to have you back and share that with us. So I want to thank you for coming out today.
Yeah.
That was powerful. Like I said, I gained clarity too.
Oh, good.
So I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today.
My pleasure.
And again, can you just give everybody the ways that they can contact you?
Yeah, Grace for Living After Loss on all the social media channels. And I wrote a book called You're Not Crazy, You're Grieving. That's available on Amazon.
That's awesome. So thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel for other great content just like this. So have an amazing day. Be blessed. And remember, if it makes good money sense, hey, that's what we're here for. So have a great day.